career became over. He's a good audiologist, a man and a woman. They're a husband and wife, but two of them. They're real honest-to-God audiologists. Her doctorate is in Baylor.
It's a pleasure to be here. If the folks in the back can't hear me, put your hand up. I'll speak a little louder. Is there anyone here who does not know who Francis Marion is or was? Well, that makes this talk a little easier. As you know, in 1780, when the British took over South Carolina, he organized the resistance and for many months was the only person basically leading a resistance. And so he becomes very important. Somebody can't do that without having some training and background. You don't just become a military leader overnight. And so what we're going to do is explore some of the things that led or allowed him to perform this role. That's me. Yeah. I'm going to start by defining a few terms because we really have to understand those terms to understand what's going on. The first term is militia. And in 1760 and 1780, militia was all males between 16 and 60. You were required to show up to 4 drills per year. You were taught very basic military skills like how to fire a musket, how to march back and forth and that sort of thing. Not a lot, but some. The next group of soldiers in South Carolina were provincials. Now, these were soldiers that were raised by the governor. The governor appointed the officers. They were trained as regular British troops would have been trained. They had uniforms, which the militia generally didn't have. They enlisted for a period of years or months, as opposed to serving for 6 months or 90 days, as the militia did. The officer corps was appointed by the governor. The idea was you appointed officers who had standing in the community, who were important men in the community, and the thought was they could then attract enlisted soldiers, and once they got on duty, the British would train them to be proper officers. Now that might sound kind of strange by today's standards, but in fact that's the way the British Army trained its regular officers at that period of time in the 1760s and earlier, and quite frankly throughout the 18th century. If you were a British officer, you bought your commission and learned your trade on the job. The regular line officers, of course, were full-time professional soldiers. They showed up from time to time in the militia, not in the militia, but in the colonies, and they were taught a very set form of fighting, which this slide really depicts. The soldiers were from the dregs of society. The weapons were not very accurate. So what they did is they lined the soldiers up 3 deep, shoulder to shoulder, and in European fashion, they'd find a big open field. The other side did the same thing. You can see here the sergeant, his job is to make sure the men are in a nice straight line and don't move, and they would present their weapons. No word for aiming in the manual of arms. You presented your weapons, you fired, and then you used the bayonet to charge across the field, and the troops that had the best discipline generally won. Now, another term is the flank, which is the side. Every army has a side, and you're vulnerable on your flank because if the enemy gains your flank or your side, they can fire down your entire line, and you cannot present weapons to repel that. The last military unit I want to talk about are the Rangers. The Rangers initially were recruited from the locals, and they basically maintained the frontier forts. They're not Rangers as we think of them as today. All right, so one of the most successful, I hope you can all read this and take this down. one of the most successful Rangers was Robert Rogers from New Hampshire. He was so successful, the British Army told him to write down his rules for Rangers, which is what this is. There is outside where the muskets are a copy of this, and you can get it on the internet by Googling Rogers rules for Rangers. Not Robert's Rules of Order, which is parliamentary. The other factor that's going to come in here are the Cherokee Indians. This is early printed Cherokee Indians, and a ambush by those Indians, which this drawing on a powder horn depicts. And this guy here, who is General Grant, who will run a campaign against the Cherokee Indians. And that is the extent of my slides. All right, if you could bring up the lights. At the height of the colonial era, we have what we call the French and Indian War. This was in 1754. Prior to this, the colonies were pretty much neglected by England. In 1754, there is this battle between the French and the English for control of North America. And the British, for the first time, send lots of troops over here to try to hold on to their colonies. Now, these troops come from all of the prejudice of having fought in Europe in open fields as those formal troops I showed you. That's the way they fought battles. That's the way they thought battles should be fought. The colonists, on the other hand, had over 100 years of fighting Indians, and they fought entirely different. They fought from behind trees. They had aimed fire. They didn't stand up in lines. General Braddock of the British Army decides that he's going to push the French out of what is today Pittsburgh. They had built a little fort out there in the western part of Pennsylvania. He gets together an army of roughly 1,500 guys, and they march out towards Pittsburgh to drive out the French and Indians. And they are attacked, they're ambushed, and Braddock forms his men in the best British form possible, nice straight lines, and they volley fire into the woods with no effect. The provincials decide that they're going to fight Indians their way. They start to break out of lines. They get behind trees to fire. The regulars force them back into lines. They figure these provincials are cowards. They won't stand in a line to fight. And the result is, of Braddock's group, only 500 return to tell the tale. He's pretty much wiped out. He is killed. He is buried in the road. The army marches over his body so the Indians will not dig him up and mutilate the body. His successor, Jeffrey Amherst, decides there needs to be a change in tactics. And what they come up with is a concept of light infantry. The light infantry were going to be trained as the provincials fought. They would be the smallest men in the unit. They would be the smartest men in the unit. They would be the best shots in the unit. They would be people who could act independently, and they would be trained to fight by taking cover behind trees, picking their targets, often armed with rifles rather than muskets. They would be out ahead of the army. They would be on the flanks. They would protect the main army from ambush in the woods. The best man in the woods was Robert Rogers, major from New Hampshire. And knowing this, Amherst tasked him with writing out his rules of ranging, how to behave and fight in the woods, which he did. Amherst then sent 50 of his officers to Rogers to learn how to fight Indians, regular officers. And these men were trained and they were sent back to the line units to form these light infantry companies that would fight Indian style, basically, in the woods as part of the regular British Army. The light infantry was then incorporated into the line units and became a specialty branch of the regular army. In 1754 through 1760, this was the avant-garde. This was the new thing. These were the shock troops for the British Army. All right, now we're going to step back for a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about Francis Marion, then we're going to come back to history. At 16, Francis Marion was required to register for the militia. At 16, he went to sea. I don't know if there's a cause and effect thing there, but he went to sea. He was shipwrecked, spent a number of days in a lifeboat, and saw of 6 men who got into the lifeboat and the dog. The dog didn't survive very long. He was eaten. 2 of the men died, and the 4, including Francis, were eventually rescued. He learned something from this. He learned a number of things. One, he didn't want to be a sailor. That was the first thing he learned. The second thing he undoubtedly learned was navigation, because he was very well connected, and given his family connections, there's no way he would have gone to sea as a common sailor. He was undoubtedly going to sea to learn how to be a ship's master. The other thing he learned is he learned about men in distress, and he learned to face his own mortality. And these are things that later in life we learned that he would never use roads. He went in straight lines across the swamp. He seemed to find his way best at night, dark, moonless nights when the stars were up. He was navigating. And the courage that he had, that he displayed in later life, undoubtedly was as a result of having come to grips with his own mortality in a lifeboat. Okay, now going back for a second to world history. Cherokees fought with the British during the French and Indian War. They fought for them. The French and Indian War comes to an end. The Cherokees are up north, because that's where most of the fighting was, up on the Canadian border. They are coming home through Virginia. There's an altercation between the white settlers and the Cherokees. Cherokees, a bunch of them are killed by the white settlers. The Cherokees get home and they decide to wage war. They get home in South Carolina, because that's where they're from, and they decide to wage war against the civilians in South Carolina. And there is bloodshed across the frontier. Henry Littleton, who is the governor at the time, calls out his militia from South Carolina, marches them off to the wilderness. He's very arrogant with the Cherokees about forming a peace treaty. He gets out to Fort Prince George. Francis Marion was not officially part of that expedition, but apparently signed on as a volunteer, so he was present. Littleton gets out to Fort Prince George, and he realizes his militia are undisciplined, are mutinous, are not equipped, not trained, and are totally incapable of fighting the Cherokees in the wilderness. So Littleton makes a quick treaty with the Cherokees, a very unfair treaty, and he goes home declaring victory. And we've heard that before. What lesson could Francis Marion take away from this? That untrained militia can't fight battles. Discipline is important. And later in his life, he will be known as a rigid disciplinarian. He knows the value of discipline. Next governor up in line, William Bull. He knows that the Cherokees are still on the warpath. He asks for regular troops from Amherst. Amherst is the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. Amherst sends a Scotsman, Archibald Montgomery, with 1,400 Highlanders. They immediately march into the woods. They burn all of the Indian villages that are close to the settled areas, what are known as the lower villages. They put all the Indians they could find, men, women, and children, to death. This is cleaned up in the press that say we don't kill women and children, but in fact they did. He starts to move into what's called the middle Cherokee towns. To do this, he has to go through some defiles in the mountains, some very narrow areas. He's ambushed there by the Indians. He gets out of it with enough loss of life that he cannot continue, but he claims that he's the winner because he's standing on the ground and the Cherokees have left, and that's the English definition of winning. Cherokees figure they have won because Montgomery has not been able to penetrate into their next group of settlements. Montgomery goes home claiming victory, and of course that doesn't last very long. Bull knows that's not going to last very long, so he raises a provincial regiment that he will control, and Francis Marion is commissioned as a lieutenant in that regiment under Captain William Moultrie, who is commissioned as a lieutenant. And then the two of them go out to recruit along with the other officers, and this is the first time we see Marion's name in print, where he's given a kudos for recruiting his company to full strength. The governor starts the provincial regiment out to the western forts to defend against the Indians. They get to the Congaree, and all of a sudden, James Grant arrives in Charleston, regular officer, colonel, survivor of Indian massacres, a guy who is a hard-nosed professional service soldier, and he halts the provincials at the Congaree to stay there. And they do, they spend the winter there, and it's a horrible winter because although the provincials have all of the best men in the province there as officers, and none of them have ever run a military campaign, and so there are no supplies, there are no tents, there's nothing, and it's a miserable winter, and Francis Marion learns his next lesson, that is you have to supply your army. You can't just say, we're going to go on a campaign, you need to have supplies. Harry Lee, during the Revolution, would comment that Marion's entire attention was consumed with getting supplies for his men and annoying the enemy. So the importance of supplies was not lost on Francis Marion. Grant arrived with 2 light infantry companies from the 17th Regiment, regular regiment, 2 light infantry companies from the 22nd Regiment, a bunch of regular troops, and a detachment of Rogers Rangers, commanded by a Lieutenant Farrington, complete with Stockbridge and Mohawk Indians. He came with about 1,262 men. The first thing Grant does is he starts to work on supplying the expedition. He gathers horses and provisions, and he works on creating a forward base. 220 of the best provincials, including Marion, are sent to 96 with 50 wagon loads of flour. They would be followed by 3 other wagon trains of provisions out to 96. Now 96 is described as a fort, but all 96 is at this time is a barn surrounded by a palisade fence, which is nothing more than a bunch of stakes with sharpened tips. So that when Moultrie and Marion get out there, the first thing Moultrie wants to do is to enlarge the area so they can put more material in there, and he entrenches it, digs a ditch to strengthen this fort. Even in its poor condition, 96 has already repelled 2 Indian sieges in the last several months at the time Marion gets there, and its men have been ambushed when they go out to hunt, so it's a dangerous area. The road to 96 is hardly worth calling a road. Each of the groups that go out comment on how difficult the trip out is, and how that every time it rains, the road washes out, and they have to constantly build bridges. They have to constantly cut down trees. They're building the road as they go, each time each group goes out. And I think if Marion learned a lesson from this, it was how difficult it is to supply a military force at 96, which the British will try to do in the next war, and how horrible the rains can be, and what nasty things they can do to the roads. Well, of course, you folks here know about rain, so I don't have to tell you about that. When French keeps a diary, the captain of the light infantry, Marion kept a diary, actually, but that diary is lost. But French's exists, and it's kind of interesting because he describes that road and how difficult it was. He also says when he gets out to 96, the first thing that greets him is this howling of wolves. Wolves are everywhere. Every night they hear the wolves, and the wolves are coming right into the camp. So they have a lot of trouble with wolves. And the second night that they're there, the Chickasaw Indians, who must have gone out with Moultrie, and the Mohawk Indians, and the Stockbridge Indians, who are Mohegans actually, all get together, and the Chickasaws want to have a war dance, so they build a big bonfire, and they look over at the Mohawks and they say, well, they're polite Indians, you know? So they invite the Mohawks and the Stockbridge Indians to dance with them, and after a little bit of difficulty communicating, and they figure out what they want to do, so they all get together and they build a bonfire and they dance around it, holler and hoot the way Indians do. And they did this every couple of nights. I can imagine that must have sounded kind of good. Grant arrives in 96 with the rest of the troops, and he reorganizes. The first thing he does is he takes the commander of the light infantry from the 17th Regiment, followed by the name of Quentin Kennedy. Kennedy is one of these 50 guys that went to learn rangering from Robert's Rangers. In fact, he gets so hung up in this that he dressed as an Indian and went out with the Indians to raid. So he's a really gung-ho type of guy. They give Kennedy all of the Indians, they give him Rogers Rangers, they give him half the light infantry from the 17th Regiment, and they give him about 20 or 30 guys that are used to Indian fighting from the provincials, and they form an Indian Corps. The next thing Grant does is he's a big proponent of light infantry. Because he's lost half his light infantry and his Indians to the Indian Corps, he forms a light infantry company from the provincials. And according to doctrine, which Grant's a big guy for, he would have picked the smallest, most agile, the best shots, the people who were able to act independently, the cream of the crop out of the provincials to be his light infantry guys. And William Moultrie is picked to command that, and Francis Marion, and a fellow by the name of Crawford are the 2 lieutenants. So they are the cream of the crop from the provincials. They undoubtedly are trained in light infantry tactics, because it makes no sense to give somebody a title and not train them. It was British doctrine to train once you gave somebody a title. They probably would have been trained by either Kennedy or by Farrington from the Rangers, but they would have been trained in Robert Rogers' rules of ranging, and they would have been trained in light infantry tactics, which called for the light infantry to go out ahead of the main unit with rifles, preferably, to engage the enemy fighting from tree to tree or from a secured position, to act as skirmishers to protect on the flanks and on the front of the main column. These are tactics, and if you read out there the rules of ranging, these are tactics that Francis Marion would use later during the American Revolution. And you repeatedly see this in his later campaigns. When Grant moves west, he does not take wagons. Marion never took wagons with him. He puts all of his supplies on pack horses. I understand there was some reports said as many as 600 pack horses. There was 2,600 men and a herd of cattle that went with them for supplies. That column probably stretched over 4 miles in length when you put it on paths that are too narrow for wagons. The line of march is the Indian Corps came first. They're out there scouting. You're out looking for danger. The next unit out was the Provincial Light Infantry with Moultrie and Marion. The regular light infantry, the regular line troops, the guys that fight shoulder to shoulder. The provincial troops, the pack horses, the cattle, and the rear guard, which were provincials. They go through the territories of the Cherokee territories, the lower towns first. They see the burnt out villages. They come upon many areas that would have been good for ambushes. And they don't know whether there's Indians there or not, so every time they come to a place that's good for an ambush, they have to scout it out. And who's doing this? The light infantry is doing it. And they're doing it in rotation, because it's such a dangerous job. They're doing it in rotation. Sometimes Marion, sometimes French, sometimes other officers who were light infantry officers. It took a lot of guts to do, but that's what they did. When they get to Fort Prince George, one night the whole group is alarmed by this horrible noise. I can't figure out what it is at first. And what's happened is the wolves have gotten into the cattle pen. So the cattle are making a lot of noise. The wolves are making a lot of noise. And French says there was a vast howling of wolves. And at the same time, there was a big war dance with the Chickasaws, Catawbas, the Mohawks, and Stockbridge. And he says, our Indians screaming at the same time, making it impossible to tell what it was. So just visualize this at night, the bonfires, the screaming, the wolves. It had to be a horrible and disturbing set of events. Later in the Revolution, Marion would have Indians in his unit, in the brigade, and the British would complain that they would whoop and holler all night long. So Marion, knowing how disquieting that could be, made no effort to control that behavior on the part of his troops. He probably even encouraged it. We come to June 10th, and Grant's army is approaching the place where the ambush took place with Montgomery the year before. And again, the light infantry's out front. Ahead of them is the Indian Corps. And just as they're clearing their last campsite, shots ring out against the cattle at the rear of the column. And this is a diversionary attack. There's a few shots ring out. Grant sends 50 troops back from the provincials to protect his rear. In the meantime, the main body has come to this place that is very, very narrow. On the right is a mountain. On the left is a stream that cannot be forded at that point in time, and a mountain above that. It is so difficult, the horses are having a hard time getting through. This is what, in military terms, we call the killing zone. This is where they're going to have the ambush. This is the killing zone. It's where the British column under Grant can't maneuver. They're just stuck there, they're like fish in a barrel. But fortunately, Kennedy is out there on the flank with his Indian Corps, and he turns up the Indians that are waiting in ambush. And there's some firing between the Cherokee and between him and Kennedy, and Kennedy flushes them out. And when the Indians figure they have been discovered, there's a war whoop that goes up and down the whole length of Grant's column from the Cherokee on both sides of the river, and the fighting begins. Grant knows he cannot fight, he can't deploy, he doesn't try to deploy. His tactic is to get his men as quickly as possible out of this kill zone. And so he tells his light infantry up front, you've got to push ahead. So he has Kennedy on the mountains, engaging the Indians, preventing them from firing down into the column. The Indians across the river at a little bit too great a distance for effective fire. And in the front of the column, the light infantry is tasked with pushing through the Indians in front of the column, because Grant has now been attacked on 4 sides, pushing through the Indians blocking the front of the column to push a half mile ahead to where there's a ford across the river, to seize the ford at the river, to cross the river, to establish a base on the other side of the river, to seize the hill that overlooks that ford, and to protect the main army as it crosses the river. And to this, the light infantry is charged, and to this, the light infantry applies themselves with great vigor, and they are successful. They break through the Indian in the front. Kennedy keeps them, as French would say, amused on the side, and they cross the river, and the column gets out of the ambush trap. 5 officers were wounded, 47 men are killed or wounded. There was 40 horses, and the bulk of the casualties are in the provincials, but French relates that his men have behaved, our men, he says, have behaved bravely, returned their fire, the Indians' fire, advanced briskly up the hills, and pushed forward with great intrepidity across the river. Marion was part of this, and in his diary, he says he's the guy that forced down the road. He's the point of the spear that forces the way through the Indians in the front of the column. And there's absolutely nothing to indicate that was not the case. Neither Grant nor French nor anybody else who writes records the names of the officers who were in charge of the columns of the light infantry who pushed through for the main column. But we know that did occur. And we know from James that Marion had done something of great importance during the French and Indian War, but nobody could remember by James's time what that was. So what did Marion learn out about all of this? Well, he learned about ambushes. And he learned how to get out of ambushes, because he saw how Grant did it. He learned the importance of having your men properly supplied. He learned about not fighting on the enemy's grounds, pick your own ground. He also learned, it's interesting, when he had ambushes, he frequently would attack on more than one side. But he never attacked on 4 sides, because he said if you attack on 4 sides, men, if they think they cannot escape, will sell their lives dearly. He always wanted his enemy to be able to think there was a way of getting away. Marion learned about killing fields. He learned about the difficulty of crossing a river under fire. And if you remember in the Bridges campaign, he always forced the British to cross rivers under fire. And this is something anybody who has been in the infantry knows. Crossing a river under fire is probably one of the hardest things for an infantryman to do. So Marion learned a lot out of this campaign, and you see those lessons applied later during the Revolution. After this one ambush, the Cherokee basically fall away. The battle lasted from 8:30 till noontime, and there was sporadic fighting for about 2 hours afterwards. But after this one battle, there's not much resistance to Grant. And Grant goes forward into the Indian towns, and he orders all the towns burned. He orders all the crops torn up. He orders all the men, women, and children found to be killed. The reality is the Indians have already evacuated most of their people from the towns. The troops come across 2 women, 1 warrior, and 1 old man, who are all tortured and killed by the friendly Indians. Later, Andrew Pickens would say that he learned from this campaign how cruel the British really were. Marion wrote a letter home, which I believe is a true letter. Some people dispute it, but it appears in Symp's work, and Symp had the benefit of having Horry's manuscript in front of him. I will read the letter because it's indicative of who Francis Marion was. He writes, we arrived at the Indian towns in the month of July, and as the lands were rich and the season had been favorable, the corn was bending under the double weight of lusty roasting ears. We encamped the first night in the woods near the fields where the whole army feasted on the young corn, which with fat venison made a most delicious treat. The next morning we proceeded, by order of Colonel Grant, to burn down the Indian cabins. Some of our men seemed to enjoy this cruel work, but to me it appeared shocking sight. Poor creatures, thought I, we surely need not grudge you such miserable habitations. But when we came according to orders to cut down the fields of corn, I could scarcely refrain from tears. I saw everywhere around the footsteps of little Indian children where they had lately played under the shelter of the rustling corn. No doubt they had often looked up with joy to the swelling stalks. When we are gone, I thought, they will return, and peeping through the weeds with tearful eyes, will mark the ghastly ruins poured over their homes, and the happy fields where they had so often played. Who did this, they will ask, their mothers? The white people. The Christians did it, will be the reply. There's a lot of bitterness in that letter. Marion was a farmer. Grant would boast that he destroyed 1,400 acres of crops, that he burned 15 towns and put 5,000 people into the woods to starve. He was happy about that. He boasted about that. Different person than Francis Marion. The last lessons Marion learned, he learned how the British waged war. And when it came to South Carolina during the Revolution, they were not much different treating white folks than they had treated Indians. The main difference is they didn't kill the women and children, but they hung a lot of guys. And probably the very last thing Francis Marion learned, as a soldier, you have to live with what you've done. And as he went forward to the American Revolution, he urged upon his followers not to engage in needless cruelty. And he, at the end of the war, urged everybody to stop the fighting and to forgive those who had been involved. And that's my talk. Thank you. Any questions?
Was there any relationship between the grant and the Civil War grant?
I doubt it. The grant from the general grant of Grant's campaign was an Englishman who went home to England after the American Revolution. He disliked tremendously Americans. He thought they were all cowards. He had very low opinion of American soldiers. He was governor of Florida for a while, but he did not stay in the United States.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do we know where Fort Prince George is?
Yeah, well, right now it's under a lake. Yes, they do know where it is, but it's an area that's been covered by water.
Karen,
Yeah.
did Marion's troops always wear uniforms?
No. The question was, did Marion's troops always wear uniforms? And the answer to that is no. When he was in the provincial regiment during the French and Indian War, the men wore uniforms. When he was in militia before that, they didn't wear uniforms. When he became a Continental soldier, the men wore uniforms when they had them. During the time he was a partisan, the men came with whatever they had. Towards the end, some men had uniforms and some didn't. Towards the end of his partisan career, towards the end of the war, he did put out an order for the men in his brigade to wear uniforms, and he actually designated different colors for different companies. Whether or not they actually were able to put that into effect, I don't know, but there was an order for them to do that. The uniforms would have been very simple, though. In the back.
How old was the security campaign?
He had been about 28 during the Cherokee War, and that was the first fighting he'd seen. He'd gone with Littleton before, but there was no fighting. So this was the first time he actually saw fighting. Other questions? Yeah.
Grant, Murray, I think Amherst, Montgomery, these are all some of Cumberland's men in the rising in Scotland in 1845 and had participated in the punishment of the rebels in Scotland.
You mean 1745?
1745, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you see anything, any connection perhaps between what these people did in Scotland and what they're doing to the Cherokee?
Well, yeah, the question is there any connection between the way that the British officers treated the Scots in Scotland and the way they treated the Cherokees? They were miserable to everybody, all right? They were committed genocide against the Scots, quite frankly. And then at the beginning of the French and Indian War, they decided that there was a bunch of French in Acadia in Nova Scotia that were supposedly French neutrals, and they decided they didn't like them. And so they basically committed genocide against the Acadians when they went in, gathered them up for no particular reason, scattered them all over the world, just burned their homes, destroyed all their livestock. Same deal as they did with the Cherokees. And if you read the accounts of the numbers of those guys, those folks, men, women, and children who died, it was genocide, there's no doubt about it. Some of those Acadians were settled in, or not settled, they were deposited in South Carolina where they were put to work on the plantations a little better than slaves. So the British had a long history of being absolutely miserable to people they didn't like. And they were miserable to the Cherokees, given the fact that Cherokees had been their allies in the French and Indian Wars. They were miserable to the Acadians who had pledged neutrality. In fact, the interesting thing with the Acadians is the reason that they were deported is they would not take an oath of allegiance to the British king. And if you look at what happened in South Carolina, we have the militia that surrendered at Charleston, and then they refused to take, some of them refused, but they were asked to take the oath of allegiance to the king, and the minute they did, they were then required to fight for the king. So, I mean, you have a repetition of conduct, which is absolutely horrible. And Weems, in his book, has Marion saying something which probably was said, and that is, at some point, Gates is defeated. Marion has been working with the Williamsburg militia. Marion realizes how bad the defeat of Gates is. Sumter was defeated about the same time. So Marion's all alone, and he decides he's going to withdraw to North Carolina for a while, and his men, there's this big drum, they really don't want to go, but Marion knows he has to go. But he has this conversation that Weems puts into his mouth, which I think may actually be true. He says, we'll wait here a little bit, and then they're going to see what the British do. And once they see what the British do, talking about the population, then they're all going to support me. And so I have a feeling this may be an actual conversation Marion had with his troops, because when he sends people back, what have the British done? They're burning houses, they're destroying livestock, and one of the nasty things they would do is they would, when they would go to a farm, they wouldn't just take 1 or 2 cows, they'd take everything, you know, and they'd leave people with absolutely nothing. And this was called quartering on somebody. So, and they wouldn't pay for it. So there was, you know, they just treated everybody miserably. And part of the problem with the American Revolution is Great Britain now is our very best friend in the world. And they were our very best friend for 2 world wars. And it's a little hard to teach the American Revolution and teach how really miserable they were during that war without impinging on a very good friend right now. So the Revolution is an inconvenient war for modern politics. Other questions? One more and then we have to go. Chris.
At Spruce Pine in North Carolina, at the Mineral Museum, there is a plaque honoring Francis Marion for clearing out that pass, which would have been Gillespie Pass. Couldn't possibly have been there. I didn't tell them they were wrong. I'd rather them honor him someplace wrong than not honor him at all. But obviously, that pass, I think Joe Epley will talks about that in the Kings Mountain event, but that's awfully far east.
I did not make a study of the geography because I was concerned about the training. We had a very excellent presenter here a number of years ago that did talk about the geography and about where that was.
Scott.
Yeah.
Scott. And he says it was much farther west, because then Gillespie Pass is at Little Switzerland, just above Marion, North Carolina.
There is, I'll talk to you offline. In my reading, there was actually a notation from somebody who came through a pass, and they said, oh, what are all those rocks there? These are Indian graves from the battle. But we'll talk about that offline.
Okay.
Thank you. Offline, they have to move forward. I'm getting up. One last question.
Well, I just wanted to, I'm Randall Jones, and Christine's point, I was just at Gillespie Gap and looking at that very plaque. And Etcho Pass is actually in South Carolina, well over to the west. But it's the myth of it being there is why Marion, North Carolina is named Marion. So we got a freebie there.